when I first launched the podcast, I probably had 20 odd interviews ready. Maybe not edited and fully done, but I'd done the interviews. And when the pandemic hit, if I hadn't had that, I probably wouldn't have been able to keep going.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Podcast for Podcasters podcast. Today with us we have Jeremy Cline, the host of the Change Work Life podcast, where he helps listeners beat the Sunday blues and get excited again about the week ahead. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course, thank you for coming on. So we've been working together for the past year or two, and I've had the pleasure of listening to many of your episodes. But if you could start by letting our listeners know a little bit about what your podcast is about and why you started it, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, sure. So my podcast is for the person who they're in, let's call it midlife. I mean, that could be anywhere from mid-30s to mid-50s. And they've been doing their job now for the past 10, 15, 20 years. And they're looking forwards and thinking, do I really want to be doing this for the next 10, 15, 20 years? I'm not sure that I do. But they're feeling a bit stuck. They don't really know which way to turn. And so my podcast is really aimed at helping that person just to enjoy working life better. So it could be that what they need is a complete change of career. It could be that it's not a complete change, it's just the way they do things. Maybe it's what they focus on, the way they work. They're looking for ways to make their working life more satisfying, more enjoyable. And so I help them with interviews with either people who have been through very significant career changes themselves. So think accountant to canine behaviorist, or IT guy to hypnotherapist. Um, or they're with the coach type people. So we might talk about the big deep stuff like how do you figure out what you want to do, or it could be some of the more tactical things like how to write a CV, how to prepare for interview, how to negotiate salary, that kind of thing. And well, your listeners have probably guessed the reason why I started the podcast. The person that I described at the beginning, yeah, it looks an awful lot like me. I started the podcast because I was in that place where I was thinking, what do I really want to do for the next 20 years of working life? And so a big motivator for me for starting was to find out myself.
So part of the reason you started the podcast was to do the research around that topic. And I know you've had quite a few amazing guests on your shows that have, as you said, been through some incredible career changes. Have you found that doing the podcast you have learnt a lot from the people you've had on?
I have learned a massive amount from the people I've had on, and not just during the course of the interviews themselves. I mean, there's been a lot of themes which have come through. So, I mean, the one that comes immediately to mind is the power of networking and building your network and just getting out there and meeting other people and learning from them to see how they can help. But also, and it was some way into the podcast when I realized that I was enjoying doing the podcast, but it wasn't getting me all that much closer to figuring out what I wanted to do. And so I needed a bit more help myself. So that was when I got coaching, actually for the second time. I got some coaching which helped me start the podcast in the first place, and then some more coaching to help me figure out, okay, I've got this podcast now, what do I do with it? And the fact that I had already interviewed my coach on the podcast made it very, very easy for me to choose who that was going to be. I'd effectively already done my due diligence. I knew that we'd get on. I knew that she'd be able to help me, and that's exactly what happened.
Amazing. So you could use the podcast as a form of networking in itself.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the things I'm doing now actually is reaching back out to previous guests and just reconnecting, finding out how they're getting on, finding out what's happened since they did the interview, because it's quite interesting. I've spoken to a couple of people who maybe they went from job to starting their own business, and they've now gone back to doing a job, albeit a different area for various reasons. So it's been really interesting catching up with people.
So I think that's one of the great things about a podcast is one thing to say to somebody, could we have a chat? And often they'll say, I don't know you, and they might ignore your message. But it's quite another to say, would you like to come on my podcast and have a chat? But towards that theme, how have you found the guests for your show? Is that from cold outreach online or?
It has been a real mix, and it has definitely evolved as I've gone on. When you start out, no one knows you, and so you've got to do much more of the hard work in finding your guests. And so most of the guests that I started with were either people that I already knew who I had a fair idea would want to be on the podcast, or I reached out just to my sort of local town Facebook group and said, hey, I'm starting this podcast. I'm looking for people who've been through career changes. Anyone got a story they'd like to share? And one of the benefits of where I live, it's what you'd call a commuter town. So lots of people work in London, used to live in London, move out because they want, more space, start a family, that kind of thing. And many of them realize that they just don't want to do the commute anymore. And so they start doing something else. So I knew it was likely to be a pretty good source of possible guests. So a lot of my early guests I found that way. And once you've been around a bit and you get yourself well known, you start to get people contacting you to be on your guest, and that might to be on your podcast, and that might be through there's some of the like podcast matchmaking sites. So there's Podmatch, there's Matchmaker.fm, there's various others, and also I've had some emails, quite a few emails, just from publicists, so people who are being paid by potential guests to appear on as many podcasts as they can get on, because they've usually got a book coming out or a service or product that they're launching, or they just want to get out there. And sort of the longer I've been around, the more of those emails I've received. It has to be said, most of the quality of those emails and the people they're pushing aren't very high, and probably 90% of those go into the, oh, well, that was interesting, no thank you. But occasionally I'll see a potential guest, and think, okay, that's a topic I'm interested in exploring. That sounds like they could be quite interesting. And yeah, I've had a few great guests that way. And otherwise it's been through, personal networks.
Amazing. So I'd like to touch on that a little bit more, about the vetting process that you go through. Is that just from reading their application and seeing if it sounds like a good fit, or is there any further vetting that you do?
Yeah, so I try not to be overly rigorous, because it's one of these things where you could drive yourself crazy with it. So let me give you the example of a cold outreach from one of these agencies. First of all, I'll read the email once, and if it doesn't immediately go, yes, that sounds like a good fit, that sounds like a topic I'm interested in exploring, then I'll just go, oh, not worth doing any more work on it. So I'll read the email, and if they've attached a one sheet, I'll look at that. If it does strike a bell, then I might dig down a little bit. So I might look at their website, I might look at other interviews that they've already done, try to get a feel from them. And then in nearly all cases, and this is however guests come out to me, I will usually have an initial conversation with them. So just a 15-minute chat, just so we can get to know each other a bit better, find out what they want from a podcast interview. They can get an understanding what I want and what I'm about. And in most cases, that will usually then lead on to an interview itself. But there have been a few occasions where I've thought, okay, maybe there's something interesting here, and we've had a conversation, and I've just thought, this isn't going to be a good fit. And that can actually be quite hard to do once you've already invested in meeting the person. And they usually, everyone I speak to, they're all very nice and everything. But you just get that feeling that I can't see how I'm going to turn this into an interview which is going to be of value for the listeners. And so I have to say, look, it's been lovely meeting you, but I just don't think at the moment it's a good fit.
So that pre-interview 15-minute talk is fascinating, and that may answer my follow-up question, which is about how you plan your interviews, the topics you cover, the questions you ask. One of the things I really like about your show is it seems very structured in the conversations that you have. it definitely seems like they have a beginning and a middle and an end, and they kind of take you on a journey. But at the same time, it has the fluidity and it doesn't sound like a question and answer forced way. So I'd be interested in how you plan your interviews.
Yeah, and it depends on the category of guest. So if it's a career changer, then broadly speaking, the format is taking us through their journey. So what is it they were doing? What was the thought process that led them to think that they wanted to try out something else? What were the challenges along the way? How have things evolved? What were the limiting beliefs that they had to overcome? That kind of thing. So it's focused much more on their journey. And with the more coach type guest, then what I'm trying to get out of it is usually a specific thing. So is it a best practices for writing your CV, or you know, strategies for negotiating salaries, that kind of thing? And so I'll have some much clearer ideas about what it is that I want to get out of. It is an interview about a particular topic, and so I'll plan my questions accordingly. I very rarely send out questions beforehand to guests. I'll do that sometimes where I think it might help, but usually I'm pretty confident that the guest is going to be fine with answering the questions. It's either their area of expertise. Well, it's their area of expertise either because it's about them, or it's about something which forms part of their work. So I'll send out the questions occasionally, but not very often, and that helps with just making it a natural conversation. That there's been a couple of occasions where I've sent out interview questions beforehand, and I get to those questions and people sound a little bit rehearsed, and it just sounds unnatural. But so I mean, I'll have a list of questions, the things that I want to cover in front of me, but I always see that very much as a guide, and I always tell my guests beforehand, and in interviews we usually do go a little bit off piste. So they'll be saying something and I'll think, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I've got an interview coming out in a month or two's time where the focus is about their change. And we ended up having quite a deep dive conversation all about how they used LinkedIn to build up their business, which wasn't something I was looking to get out of it. She just mentioned it to begin with, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Let's dive into that a bit more. Fundamentally, I'm just a bit nosy and quite like asking questions.
Amazing. I imagine your nosiness probably helps in a lot of ways.
I think so, yeah.
How long have you been running the podcast for now?
First episode dropped in October 2019, so it's 3.5 years ago. Probably 4 years since I first sort of started planning it and recording interviews and things. I ended up having about 6 months before kind of my day one of beginning the podcast, and when the first episodes came out, and I announced myself to the world.
Amazing. So 3.5 years is a decent amount of time. I imagine during that time you've learned a lot. Your process has probably changed and definitely gotten a lot more streamlined, I would imagine. How has that process changed in that time?
The biggest change over that time has been the fact that I have outsourced a reasonable part of it. There's still quite a lot I do myself, but when I first started, I was doing almost everything myself, from the finding the guests, recording the interviews, recording the intros and outros, doing the editing myself. I suddenly had to learn Audacity, which it's got about 500 features, of which I probably use about 3. I was doing the show notes myself. I was doing the only thing which I stopped doing myself very, very early on was editing the transcripts. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to provide full transcripts for each episode. And I also wanted them to be actually useful. So something that people could read without too much effort. And I didn't have the budget to pay a human transcriber to do it minute by minute. So I used one of these AI transcription generators. I used something called otter.ai, which is still around, which does a fairly decent job, and it's probably improved over time. But I started to go through my first ever episode, which was, I think, 7 minutes. It was, an introductory episode, what the podcast was about, why you should listen to it. And I started editing the transcript, and it was just me talking. And it was so painful that I just thought, this is going to take me forever and it is going to drive me around the bend. So I pretty much outsourced the editing of the transcript straight away. And that was just, even though the podcast wasn't earning me any money, I mean, it still doesn't earn me any money of itself, of the podcast itself. But I just knew that I wouldn't make progress. And frankly, I'd probably have stopped if I'd had to do all that myself. It was such a painful process.
Yeah, that's exactly it, is that often outsourcing those things can keep the passion alive and keep you going. In 4.5 years, you have to really have a lot of commitment to keep on going for that amount of time. Have you ever had periods where you've thought about stopping or you've lost some of that inspiration?
The reasons I have thought about stopping haven't been through lack of enjoyment, but they have been about more, is this the best use of my time? So the podcast was my first step, if you like, into entrepreneurship. So starting something for myself which would enable me to quit my job and do that full time. And I didn't have a very good idea what that was going to be when I started the podcast. And, I somewhat naively thought that, I'll start a new podcast, just get a few tens of thousands of downloads. I mean, how hard can it be? And, make money through sponsorship, advertising, that kind of thing. And as time went on, I realized, especially when I was doing everything myself, that it was consuming so much time that I wasn't making any progress towards whatever this escape plan was going to be. And that thought has kind of always come back to me. Is this the thing which is really going to get me there? So more recently now, I've started a business and career coaching practice, and I'm spending time getting out there, finding new clients, that sort of thing. And occasionally I kind of think, but would it make sense to put a pause on the podcast so I can focus more on doing that? And then I come back to the fact that the podcast has created many of those opportunities, and I'm very loath to do it. So there's definitely an internal struggle in my mind, but it doesn't usually arise from losing the passion for it. Occasionally I kind of think, oh blimey, what am I going to talk about now? But there's always topics, seem to come up. Even 100 and nearly 160 episodes in, there's still seems to be plenty to talk about. It's more about whether, I've got a finite amount of time. Is this the best way of spending my time? And so far I'm still concluding that it is. And I've been thinking a bit more in terms of whether I can outsource even more of what I outsource at the moment. Because as well as the transcripts, there's, as you mentioned at the top, the show notes are handled by this great chap who does this wonderful job of doing the show notes for me. The editing is now done by someone else. Yes, that's the main things: the transcripts, the editing, and the show notes. And pretty much everything else I'm still doing myself. So the posting, checking interviews, arranging interviews. I use a scheduling service for social media, but I will be the first to admit I do not do social media very well at all. I could do it so much better. And so, yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking about is what more I could outsource. I mean, is there out there, for example, a VA who could basically do everything apart from doing the interviews? And otherwise I leave them to do everything. So obviously that comes with a cost, and I'd have to assess that, but it's something I'm thinking about.
So, the process of outsourcing the transcription, the show notes, and editing, I know we met each other through Upwork. Can you talk a little bit more about that process of finding those people to outsource, and also how you manage the team and manage the workflow?
Yeah, so first of all came the identifying the things to outsource, and you've obviously you've got to get your head around the fact that someone is not going to do things necessarily the same as you would do them, and there's definitely a process of working with someone and feeding back. And it's one of the things I've appreciated about working with you is you're very open to the feedback and when you do the show notes for me. Yeah, Upwork has been the way that I have found all of the people who I've outsourced work to. And in terms of the workflow, I guess I've just tried to make it as simple as possible in terms of giving me as little to do as possible. And so really Google Drive has been my friend here. So I've got a folder where I'll just upload the audio files for the editor, and he'll take them and piece them together and turn them into an episode and send them back to me, and then I'll check the audio. Again, with show notes, I'll just send you the complete episodes and any other bits like bios and that sort of stuff, and you'll turn it around for me, and you just, it becomes a flow. Transcriptions, again, I just upload them to Otter, share it, and then say, I've shared it with you, off you go. And Upwork, for all the faults with the platform, and the fact that they seem to be charging ever higher fees, it does make things reasonably easy to find people when you don't otherwise have sources or recommendations or contacts.
So you touched on it a little bit there, about the difficulty of passing over some of these creative processes, especially when people have spent so much time building up a podcast. It kind of becomes their own little baby. Have you ever had any times where you've maybe sent something off and you've gotten let's not do the show notes, because of course they're always perfect, but maybe you've gotten the edit back and it's just not what you wanted and not what you were after? Have you ever had something where they were just missing the mark?
Certainly, the first few edits, I wanted a bit more editing, so more closing up of gaps and removing of ums and ahs and that kind of thing. And then it's a case of just feeding back. And in most cases, that's been absolutely fine. I did have one occasion where I sent off the audio, and I just don't know what happened, but what came back was a mess. The audio was going up and down all over the place, and then it had got out of alignment. So I don't know what had happened, but it was like answering the question from 2 questions ago kind of thing. It was really strange. And when I said to the editor, look, I mean, just listen back to it, it's complete nonsense, I got a bit of a sort of shrug of shoulders. And so it was a shame, because this guy had actually been pretty good up till that point, but then seemed unwilling to make good the mistake. And so I took the decision that I wasn't going to carry on working with them, which was a bit unfortunate, but you've got to be a little bit hard-nosed about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that is one of the benefits of Upwork, as you say, that you do have such a pool of people to choose from that although the process of rehiring might not be pleasurable, at least there are people to rehire.
Yeah, it is a great platform for finding people. I've even used it myself on the other side, so to get coaching clients. And I mean, from a hirer's perspective, so when I'm looking to outsource, it's great because there is such a depth of talent out there. I mean, you do have to fish for it. And there's a guy I know who wrote this amazing article about how to find people on Upwork. So he talks about the level of detail you go into. So rather than just I'm looking for a podcast editor, going into much more detail about what the show's about, what sort of editing you want, that kind of thing. And it makes it much easier to filter out the sorts of work. And people are often willing on Upwork, I found, to do trial things. I had some research I wanted some people to do, and so I put a trial exercise on Upwork, and there were a couple of people who did it unbelievably well. And there was one person who was completely gung-ho, come on, let's do this, I'm the guy for you. And he had to go at the exercise. It was awful. It's absolutely terrible. You completely missed the point.
Oh, that's funny. As you say, I guess you've got to fish through them a little bit there. So, in the 4 years that you've been doing this podcast, I imagine you've had some episodes perform better than others, and maybe some that haven't performed well at all. Have you seen any common themes around episodes that have performed well?
The standout reason for an episode performing well is when it's shared by an engaged guest. I can think of two episodes in particular where my guest has had a very engaged following and they've publicized their interview. So this is, these are people who haven't, mine isn't one of 100 podcast interviews that they're doing. They're, I think in both cases, people who I've approached rather than them coming to me via an agency. So, it's a bit more unusual for them. They've shared it with their audience, and their audience have gone, "Oh yeah, great, okay, I'll have a listen." And I did one relatively recently on financial freedom, and a guy called Barney Whiter, fascinating person, but he shared the interview with his list, and I got the biggest spike in downloads I've ever had. So that is absolutely the biggest thing that I've seen in terms of which episodes make a difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting because at first you might think that someone who has been on a lot of podcasts is going to be a really good guest because they've got their public speaking down. And maybe someone who it's their first time might not be such a good guest. Is that something that, by the sounds of it, you haven't found at all?
You're right that people who've been on podcasts before, they've got, a certain amount of practice in what they're doing. The challenge is to conduct the interview such that they're not just going on autopilot, because you can get the impression occasionally that they're just saying the same thing that they've said over and over again, which is one of the reasons why I try not to send out questions beforehand and why I try to mix things up a bit. um, Certainly people who have never been on a podcast before, um, very often they make very, very good guests, as long as they are just open to chatting and happy to share. Then they can be absolutely fantastic guests. So if people have been doing it before, and particularly if they've got the gear, which helps with sound quality, it can be useful. And you do get people who do get very nervous, and you can see it takes them a while to warm up, but eventually they do, and you get some great content. So no, when it comes to selecting guests, it's much more about the story and the value I perceive that they can provide.
Amazing. So just before we shift gears a little bit, I'd like to ask, you mentioned how time consuming the podcast was when you started out, which is why you outsource some of this work and how you've been considering outsourcing other work. How much time did you tend to spend on an episode when you started out comparatively to now?
It's one of those things which I never actually tracked, and it probably would have been really beneficial to do so. I know that a lot of these, productivity gurus do advocate figuring out how much you spend on them, but I don't know, per episode, if you include the interviews and the pre-interview chats and the editing and everything, when I was doing everything myself, it was probably maybe 3 or 4 hours per episode, maybe even a bit more than that. It certainly seemed like a very long time.
And how's that changed since outsourcing some work?
It's probably, I mean, the biggest sort of time suck, which is not something I can particularly change, would be the actual interview itself and the conversations and everything, which is usually, I mean, interviews maybe 40 minutes, but all told, that's probably over an hour. And then just assembling everything and checking everything and that kind of thing, it's probably 2-ish hours, give or take. One of the things that I tried to do where possible is batch process, because you just get into a state of flow, and it's, you can get things done. You can get things done more quickly. So if I don't know, checking edits, then it's going to be quicker for me to check 4 episodes all in one go than it is for me to check sort of like one episode and then a few days later another episode, and so on and so forth. And the same when it comes to posting, so putting everything up on the podcast host and on my website and on the social media and all that kind of thing. If I've got, say, 4 episodes and I do it all in one go, you just get into a flow, and the first one and then the second one gets faster and then a bit faster still, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And so, do you record your episodes quite far in advance?
Yeah, the time kind of stretches and then it kind of contracts again. So just as we record, my reservoir of episodes is actually getting a little bit on the low side. So I deliberately took some time off from doing interviews so that I could spend a bit more time building up the coaching practice. Which is great, but it's now got me to a stage where I'm starting to think, have I got enough episodes here just to keep the publishing schedule going? And, worst comes to the worst, I miss out a couple of weeks. I don't think anyone's really going to be that bothered if there's a week when an episode doesn't come out. But in the past, I've had a very, very deep reservoir of episodes, particularly when I was starting, and I probably had, when I first launched the podcast, I probably had 20 odd interviews ready. Maybe not edited and fully done, but I'd done the interviews. And when the pandemic hit, if I hadn't had that, I probably wouldn't have been able to keep going, because I spend I work a kind of a split shift. So Wednesdays to Fridays are my day job. Mondays to Tuesdays are my days for podcasting, now coaching and everything. And when the pandemic hit, I've got a young daughter who was 3 at the time, something like that. And so Mondays and Tuesdays, I wasn't doing podcasting. I was doing childcare so that my wife could work undisturbed. And I was just trying to find a bit of time at weekends to get stuff going. And had I not already had loads of episodes in the can, and it was a fairly simple matter getting those up and out. Yeah, I don't think I would. And at the time, I was publishing weekly. Now I do every 2 weeks. I don't think I would have been able to keep that going.
And moving from weekly to 2 weekly publishing, have you seen any changes from doing that?
Probably been a little bit of a dip in download numbers, which isn't really that surprising. So, I get a weekly report from my podcast host, which says how many downloads I've got in the previous week. And yes, it is always higher in the weeks when new episodes come out, but it hasn't dipped as much as I thought it was going to for the weeks when I don't have an episode coming out. So there are still people downloading. But I mean, again, that was just something, it was a decision I took to create more time, even having outsourced some stuff, even having streamlined. It was still a bit of a hamster wheel of, getting the episodes out. And again, just creating no time for, working on my business. And that was one of the things that coaching really helped with, just identifying that if I was serious about starting my own coaching practice myself, that was one of the changes that I was going to need to make in order to help me get there.
Oh, that's very interesting. So one thing I want to touch on, you mentioned how with previous guests, the amount they promoted an episode really affected the viewership. How do you promote your episode?
Not very well is a short answer to that. I mean, I started with basically 0 following, so it has been very much a sort of scrapping for listeners. So you tell all your friends, you tell all your family, and some of them hopefully will listen, but they're not necessarily your target audience. And so one of the things I've worked on is figuring out where my target audience hangs out and getting involved there. And it turns out that there's an awful lot of people asking questions about career change on Reddit, which is one of those social media platforms which I think is starting to get a bit more traction, but people don't think of it as a platform so naturally to promote things as they do Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that sort of thing. So I mean, even before the podcast started, I would regularly pop up there, see if there was a question which I thought I could help out with, and answer it. And so, build up a bit of reputation, a bit of a karma, which is, the score in Reddit for if people like what you have to say. And you'd quite regularly see the same half dozen questions popping up. And so, funnily enough, those have formed the basis of some of my podcast episodes. And so now when people say, oh, I want to negotiate a pay rise, how do I do that? I can say, well, here's some things to think about. And by the way, if you want more information about that, here's an episode on my podcast, which is all about it. And so, it's not a quick way to get listeners. I mean, you are effectively getting listeners one by one, but hopefully you're getting loyal listeners that way. How I've yet to find a sort of, do this one thing and suddenly you get 1,000 extra listeners. I've not found that at all. So yeah, do let me know if you've got any ideas.
Yeah, I think if that trick existed, we'd probably all know about it already. But I'm really glad you said that because Reddit really does seem to be such a goldmine. It's where I find a lot of guests for my shows. And to hear not only that you can find viewers for your shows, but also topics for your shows is fascinating. I'd also really implore any of our listeners today to check out that episode about how to negotiate your salary. That's an episode that I actually worked on with the show notes with you, and then re-listened a couple months later, and it helped me double my salary with another client. So thank you for that.
Oh, brilliant. It's one of the things about podcasting is it's very, very hard to get feedback. It's not like YouTube where people can leave comments very easily. So, people might put on comments on a post on social media, or if they're on your email list, they might send you an email. But otherwise, it's a bit like sort of shouting into the void. And apart from seeing some download numbers, you've no idea who's listening, whether they like it, that kind of thing. So that feedback from you, that's incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for telling me.
Well, thank you. So as we're running up on time now, we've actually got about a minute and a half left. So maybe just quick top tips that you may have for anyone thinking of starting a podcast or who has just started.
So the first one I will say, just get started and do it. People get so hung up on perfection. One of the Facebook groups I'm on, you'll see people asking, what day should I release? How often should I release? How long should episodes be? Should I just do solos? Should I just do interviews, and so on and so forth? The answer to all of that is yes. I listen to podcasts which range from 7 or 8 minute episodes to 2 to 3 hours. Some of them come out weekly. Some of them come out twice or three times a week. Some of them, there'll be this weird delay and you'll kind of think, oh, where on earth did that come from? We haven't heard from them for a while. What's going on? But, you subscribe and so you hear them. Just don't worry about looking at what other people do. Just do something which fits with what you want to do.
I think that's a really good tip. Just get started. And we're just running up on time there, so we'll have to end it at that one. But thank you so much for coming on,
Okay.
Jeremy. It's been a really great chatting to you.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
All the best, and now enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you. You too.